Oathsworn is a game that might actually be better if you play it solo. What's up, everybody? Jeff here, and the folks at Shadowborn Games obviously put a ton of effort into making sure that Oathsworn is a game that you can play solo. Now, they set a very high bar for solo play games, in my opinion, so let's go through some of the reasons why that is, and some of the cool features that they've added to the game to make it easier to play if you don't have a group that wants to play with you. Now, just a quick note before we start, the developers of the game put a lot of effort into making sure that nobody gets spoiled on any of the story or the mechanics of the game before they start playing. And I definitely want to respect that because I hate getting stuff spoiled for me as well. So this video is not going to contain any story spoilers, and I'm going to allude to some very vague kind of general gameplay concepts from later in the game, but nothing specific, so don't worry about that. The only things we're going to show off here are things that are shown in the rulebook or the tutorials or right on the front page of their website. So you can still get all the surprises that everybody else would get when they first play through the game if you decide to pick it up. So just a little bit of background on the game. This is a 1 to 4 player co-op fantasy-style boss battle game. And it's a little bit different from some games that you might be familiar with that are more of a dungeon crawl, because in this game, there is no dungeon to explore. Instead, the game is split up into 2 different sections. You have the story phase and then the encounter phase. In the story phase, you can explore towns, go on different kinds of adventures, you have to take checks on different kinds of attributes, and it plays out a little bit more like a tabletop RPG. And then when you get to the encounter phase, the combat takes place on a single board, usually against one or maybe more enemies. But you're not going to be moving around across the map like a dungeon and encountering new rooms and different groups of enemies that you'll fight at different times. Now, an interesting thing to consider when you think about a game having solo play is how the game scales for the different numbers of players that might be in the game. And in my experience, there's a couple of different ways that games will tackle this type of thing. One of them would be to scale the encounters based on the number of players by adding or subtracting enemies. So a game that I'm really familiar with that handles it like that is Heroes of the Oturi Cluster, which is a fan-made co-op version of the X-Wing miniatures game. And in that, depending on the number of pilots that you had in the game, you might encounter more or fewer enemy ships, and there was a little chart to reference at the beginning of every scenario. The next way that you might balance it would be to have a system where after every player character goes, the enemies get a turn to do their thing. And in that way, the enemies will get more turns if there's more player characters, and that's how it sort of balances out. So if you've ever played the Dark Souls miniatures game, that's an example of a game that handles it this way. And the last major way that I've seen it done is the game can have you play with the same number of player characters no matter how many actual humans are playing the game. So if it's a 4-player game and there's 4 characters present at all times, then no matter how many players you have sitting at the table, there will still be 4 players in the game, and some people will just have to double up, or if you're going to play solo, you'll just play with 4 characters. And that's the way that Oathsworn handles it. Now, there's pros and cons to each of these different approaches, and I think the way that Oathsworn handles it is interesting for a couple different reasons. It's nice because setting up any particular encounter is pretty simple because nothing's going to change depending on the number of players you have at the table. There's always going to be the same number of enemies, and their health is always going to be the same, so you don't have to check a chart to keep track of any of that stuff. I think it keeps things pretty simple, and it is also a really good way to keep the game pretty well balanced because the designers of the game can always assume that there's going to be 4 player characters, and they don't have to account for different eventualities. In some cases, playing a game like this with fewer characters or 1 character can mean that you don't have access to enough variety of abilities to really make yourself sustainable throughout the game. You're not going to have a DPS, a tank, and a healer, for example, if you only have 1 or 2 characters playing the game. But on the other hand, the sort of downside to playing it this way is that if you want to try to play this game solo, then you have to control 4 characters. And obviously this is going to be up to personal preference, but depending on the type of game that you're looking for, you may not want to have to run the game with 4 characters. It can be a lot to kind of multitask and keep track of all the different characters' abilities and figuring out how to level up all the different characters. It's a lot more straightforward if you only have to worry about 1. But when it comes to Oathsworn, they've actually come up with a really interesting system that makes this problem a lot less of an issue, and that is companions. But before I explain what that means, let's get into a little bit about the combat system. This is not going to be a full tutorial. If you want to learn how to play the game, then they actually have an official tutorial that's really good. And there's definitely other channels who have covered full tutorials on how to play the game. I'm just going to kind of give you the broad strokes here. The combat system in Oathsworn is maybe my favorite that I've ever encountered in a game like this. It's really unique, and I find that it's got a lot of depth to it, so it's really enjoyable to kind of learn how to master some of the different abilities and capabilities that the characters have. So during the activation phase, when you're activating your models, every model can take as many turns either moving or using abilities, and you can kind of cycle back and forth between all 4 of the player characters. And there's really no restrictions on it. You can kind of just jump around as much as you want and do things in whatever order you want. The characters are going to generate animus depending on what character they are and what level they're at, which are these little yellow gems that go from the exhausted side to the active side of your player board. Now, when you want to move, you can spend as many of these as you'd like to move 1 space on the board per animus that you spend. And you can also spend them to use abilities out of a hand of cards that you're going to have. After you use one of the abilities, depending on the number in the top right corner, you are going to place the card in a cooldown position around your player board. Position 3 is at 3 o'clock, position 2 is at 12 o'clock, position 1 is at 9 o'clock, and position 0 is at 6 o'clock. Anytime you play one of these cards and it goes into cooldown position, it's going to move any other cards that are already in that position down to the next cooldown spot. And then at the beginning of the next activation phase, you will pick up any of the cards that are at position 0. Plus, anytime you get attacked, you can actually use these cards to boost your defense value before the attack goes through. And that kind of represents you readying yourself and defending against the incoming blow. Now, I gotta say, I was a little skeptical when I first learned about how this system works, but as soon as I tried it out for the first time, I found that I really enjoyed it. It makes the combat feel super dynamic, and there's a lot of really interesting strategies around trying to use your more powerful abilities and then cycling them around the cooldown track to get them back in your hand to be able to use next turn, or using some of the less powerful abilities and cycling them right back into your hand so you can use them twice in a turn. The whole thing makes the combat feel really strategic, and it's super engaging, and it gives the players a lot of options, and there's a lot of variability to the encounters. But even just from that brief explanation, you can probably see the issue here. If you have to run 4 of these characters at the same time, there's a lot of different things that you have to juggle and account for, and you're going to spend a lot of time just looking at the different hands of cards for the different characters and trying to figure out what your best next move is. So that's where the companion system comes in. A companion is basically just a simplified version of the characters in Oathsworn, and you can choose any number of them that you want to have in the game instead of the full version of the characters. They're simpler, but they're about equally as powerful. There's a couple of differences in the way that they play, and the first thing you're going to notice is their player board is much smaller and there's a lot less to it. Instead of having to play cards out of your hand for defense, you're just going to have a static defense value that's a little higher than a full character. And instead of having a hand of 7 cards that have different abilities on them, you're going to have 1 card with 2 options. Every turn you'll generate 2 animus, and those can be spent on an attack, a move up to your movement value, or to use 1 ability off of your ability card. So playing as the companion is a lot less granular in the sense that you don't have quite as much flexibility in terms of how you're going to move and what abilities you're going to use. You're never going to be able to use an ability twice in the same round, and if you'd like to move exactly 3 spaces and you have a move of 4, then you're spending the 1 animus either way. Whereas when you play a full character, you can spend 3 animus and move 3 spaces. You're not going to get quite as big of a defense boost as you might using some of the ability cards on a full character, but you're always going to have that baseline level of defense, which means that you're never going to be caught in a situation where you have no cards to spend and then you have a super low defense and you really get obliterated with 1 attack. I'm not saying that that happened to me, but let's just say you should be careful. Now, obviously, when you're playing a companion, you're not going to have as much flexibility because you only have 2 abilities available to you as opposed to the spread of 7. But you also don't have to worry about the cooldown on that ability because you just get to use it once per turn. Simple as that. Now, this is a really cool system because it lowers the complexity of playing the game pretty dramatically. And because you can play a mix of full characters and companion characters, it means that you can kind of adjust the complexity as you want if you want to play solo. If you want to jump into the game with 1 full character and then 3 companions, so you can just focus on the one that you really like, that's great. If you want to do 2 and 2 and kind of balance it out that way, you can do that as well. Or you can go whole hog and run 4 full characters if that's what you want to do. That's actually how I played because I'm a glutton for punishment, and I played through a whole campaign with 4 full characters. And I have to say it's very doable, but it does mean that you're going to have to spend a lot more time thinking, and it's going to make the encounters last a lot longer than they would otherwise. I constantly found myself going back to another character's hand to check which cards I had available and what cooldown position the card was that I needed and trying to find ways to synergize between the characters, and I really enjoyed it. I thought that was really interesting, but I think that a lot of people would think it was way too much and would way rather swap in some of the companion characters. But having that flexibility to adjust, I think, is a really cool thing, and it would be really interesting to see more game developers implement things like this to allow people to play games solo a little bit easier. On top of all that, there's going to be a lot of choices that get made in between the sessions, like how to equip your characters and how to get different abilities and level them up. And those are all things that kind of add to the complexity and the gameplay time when you're playing the game solo. You're going to be making those choices for 4 different characters, as opposed to just 1 while your friends make their choices for their characters. Now, another benefit of playing this solo is that even though it's going to take a lot more time to plan out your next move in the combat, it does mean that you get to plan everything yourself. You can kind of plan things out, and if there's an interesting synergy that you think is going to work out the best for the party overall, you don't have to worry about somebody else not wanting to do that because they kind of want to go and just smack the boss a few times and get all the glory for themselves and kind of leave everybody else hanging. Another really cool thing about the game that I like a lot is that it gives you the option to either roll dice to resolve combat or to flip cards. And if you've never played a game that you use cards to flip, it is a way better system. It's a way better way to implement randomness in a game. And another interesting benefit about playing solo is that you can even strategize when to flip cards and when to use certain abilities based on the likelihood of getting good results from the cards. Because there's a finite amount of them and you know roughly the mix of results that are going to be on each of the cards, if you know you've already flipped all of your blank cards, then you can kind of go hog wild and know that you're going to get some pretty good results with it. Now, in addition to all that, there's a handful of other kind of quality of life additions that they made to the game that make it much easier to jump in and, whether you're playing solo or not, kind of pick up where you left off and get exactly what you want from the game. There's a save system that lets you stop playing the game if you are at the end of the story section or at the end of an encounter. And this can be really useful for solo play if you don't have a ton of room to leave the game set up. You can kind of set it up, play through as much as you can, save it, and then put everything back in the box so that it's not going to take up too much space. On top of that, there is a system to allow you to fast level your characters. So if you just want to jump in and try one of the later scenarios so that you can kind of get a little bit of practice in before you meet up with some friends if you're going to play a normal campaign, then you have the option to do that. And you don't just have to start from the first scenario. Plus, there's something called quick action mode that allows you to do a condensed version of the story mode, where the story mode would normally take you, let's say, 45 minutes to an hour. This is one page that you read through. You get a quick abridged version of the story. It's going to make you take a couple of checks. You still get a lot of the benefits that you would get from going through the story mode, but then you really jump right into the action and you don't spend quite as much time building up to the encounter. And that can be really good if what you're looking for out of the game is really just those combat encounters and you kind of want to grind through just a bunch of boss fights. Then you don't have to spend as much time going through the story if that's not what you're worried about. Or if you just want to play through the combat because you enjoy it and you want to save the story for when you do get together with some friends to play the traditional way. And finally, you can switch out your characters on the fly. So if you start the game playing as the Ursus Warbear because you make the right decision, and then you decide that you want to make the wrong decision and switch to a different character, then you're free to do that. Or if you want to switch from a full character to a companion character, or vice versa, you can also do that. There's a whole ton of flexibility, so you can really kind of just get exactly what you want out of this game, and you don't have to worry about engaging with parts of it that you don't want to. Now, just to really drive the point home here about how much I think the developers really took into consideration what you would need to play the game as a solo player, they even accounted for it in certain aspects of the story. I don't want to get into any spoilers here, but there's a few parts of the game that I encountered where there were decisions that needed to be made, or different members of the party could choose to do things slightly differently. And when you got to those sections of the book, it actually would ask you if you're playing solo, and then it would send you on a different track so that you could play the game in a way that made a little bit more sense, being that there was only one of you to make the decision as opposed to a group. That was a nice little touch there that really drove the point home for me that this game is really designed to take into account solo play and allow you to enjoy the game just as much as if you were playing with a group. I think the Shadowborn games really set the bar high with this game. I played a couple of solo games before, just sort of dabbling to get my feet wet and maybe learn the mechanics so that I could teach some other friends how to play later. But it often kind of feels like a compromised experience. It doesn't feel like you're really getting the full play experience that you would get if you did have a group. And unfortunately, most times in those cases, I tried to get a group together, and I had a huge problem kind of getting a group that was all interested in the same game, had the time and the availability to play it, and then not having any of them lose interest in the process. I never felt super comfortable about going and playing through the game myself solo. Usually those games would just end up getting put on the shelf and collecting dust. But Oathsworn has really kind of turned me around on that. And that's why I wanted to start this series of videos. I don't know why I thought it felt different to play board games solo, because my entire life I've been playing video games primarily solo, and it never felt weird for me. But I'm coming around on it, and I think I'm going to give a couple of more solo games a shot to see what they have to offer and see if any of them are as seamless or have any of these cool features that Oathsworn has. So if you're in a similar boat to me and you have a hard time getting a group of people together, then I encourage you to give Oathsworn a shot. I didn't even really get into all of the really interesting features of the game here, like some of the unique challenges that the encounter phase poses, the NPCs, item management, the upgrade system, injuries for your characters, upgrades for the party, allied characters, and all kinds of other cool stuff. But you're going to have to check out all that stuff for yourself. If you enjoyed this video, then make sure you leave it a like and subscribe to the channel so that you don't miss what I have coming up. Be sure to get down in the comments and let me know what you thought, and also let me know if you have any recommendations for other games that are really good for playing solo. There's a whole bunch of important links in the description that you can check out, including a link to the Discord if you want to come hang out and chat with me and the rest of the community, as well as the Patreon if you want to support the channel directly. You can get a whole bunch of different kinds of perks, and I would really appreciate it. On that note, I want to send a huge thank you to the extremely cool kids here on Patreon, the Steam Powered Scoundrels, Dogmatized, Devin, and Spilled Paint Pot. And thanks for watching.